Despite the fact that a ton of games are released every year, there are some that manage to stand tall above the rest of them. I don't recall when I first heard of Hades, but before I even caught a glimpse of it, I knew that it was a beloved game that was winning people over no matter what kind of gamer they were. For the most part, games that manage to accomplish a feat such as that one deliver the goods in one way or another, but Hades is the kind of game that manages to deliver a high-level experience in just about every single way possible. There's a lot that I'll be discussing within this review, but some of the things I most enjoyed about Hades were its art, its story, the interactions between characters, the combat system, and the general gameplay. I'm sure that it's because I'm used to games taking an hour, sometimes more before they get going, so I was pleasantly surprised to see Hades start as soon as it did. This was nice because it gave me the idea that Hades would be the kind of game that wants you to learn as you go. There are ways to ease players into what they'll be experiencing, but immediately being thrown into the deep end of the pool is sometimes the best way to get players used to what they'll be experiencing for the rest of a game. Hades being the kind of the game that it is, you could say that its gameplay is repetitive, but what I liked is that it's a repetitive game that's not repetitive. Even when you play Hades the way it's meant to be played and beat the game 10 times, there's always something new to discover. Whether it be a character interaction, side quest, or special ability, there's always something new that'll end up surprising you. At times this worked against me, especially around my 6th or 7th playthrough of Hades, seeing as how I wanted to see the true ending and I wanted to move on from the game, but I still appreciated that there was enough done to keep my experience with Hades fresh well into the 50+ hours I spent with it. As my time with Hades came to an end, I felt that I had seen a great deal of what Hades has to offer, but even then, I was still left thinking that this is the kind of game where there's plenty left to see and understand. In some ways, Hades can be a mechanically complicated game, but for the most part, I'd say that its intricate combat system has more to do with the special abilities you gain, how you upgrade them, and how you pair them up with the subsequent abilities you find during your escape from Hades. It really depends on the kind of game that you're playing, what it wants to accomplish with its story, gameplay, and just about everything else, so you won't always be encouraged to engage in combat. With how Hades' story and gameplay is set up, you can't escape from combat encounters. It's possible to favor certain door selections over others and choose an ability, upgrade, or something else over a boss encounter, but on the plus side, I like how being aggressive and willingly engaging in combat is rewarded. How this is seen with bosses will be covered later on, but for now, I'd like to stick to general combat. Hades isn't a game that utilizes a combo system, but you yourself are able to get one going depending on how skilled and fast you are. This can be seen in multiple different ways, but the fact that enemies are constantly drawn into you makes it easy to get a combo going. At the same time, the more I attack, the more I can interrupt enemies from attacking me. There definitely are more specific ways that you can approach combat, but these two were what most stood out to me during my first few hours of Hades. The more time I spent with Hades, the more I realized how deep its combat and ability system really was. At one point I started to see that I was getting better with putting together a build and utilizing my abilities in the most efficient way possible, but even if that's true, I still recognize that there was more to learn. I'm sure that may turn some off from wanting to give Hades a try, but I like that because it meant that I'd be able to keep getting more out of this game the more I played it. On top of that, how the different powers would interact with each other really appealed to me. During my first few runs, I generally stuck to the abilities that I was most familiar with, and that granted me greater attack power. As I played on, I realized that I'd be better off trying to balance things out, and that was made even clearer and interesting when I learned that it was possible to combine different abilities. Besides being able to dish out more damage or simply being able to switch things up gameplay-wise, which helped with Hades' replay value, I liked how the different powers combined with each other. I know that I didn't get to try all of the different combinations that are possible, but from what I saw, it didn't feel as if things were forced or done in such a way that it didn't make sense. Much like with other aspects of Hades, it's clear that a lot of thought went into making this run as smoothly as possible. Simply recognizing that power-ups make it so that your basic abilities work at a higher level isn't worthy of praise, but what stood out to me about this was how well it was utilized. What I'm specifically referring to is that I liked how special dash attacks still worked when you were able to double or even triple dash. Once I realized that this was possible, I became more adventurous with how I maneuvered around the rooms, and this made things more entertaining for me. It was mainly because of how smooth moving around felt, but also thanks to one of Athena's dash abilities. The more projectiles I had coming towards me, the more I'd dash into them. This really stood out to me because it affected multiple different areas of gameplay at once. Not only was I able to be offensive and defensive at the same time by deflecting projectiles, I was also able to determine what my next move would be thanks to how freely I could move. The point isn't to list out what each power-up could do to your basic abilities, but some of these stood out more than others. For example, at one point I ended up getting the triple spear attack, and sometimes I just stand still while being able to attack multiple enemies at once. I realized that this is a great contrast between me utilizing agility to freely roam around the room and relying on that to kill enemies, but sometimes a safer approach was the preferred one. It's because I only managed to advance during some runs by the skin of my teeth. I wanted to progress further than ever, so if I was low on health or saw something that made me want to be more cautious, crowd control abilities such as this triple spear attack was what I most fell back on. It's possible that by the end of this review you'll be tired of how often I bring up the idea that something in Hades is great in more ways than one, but that's because it's true. The more I played Hades and became familiar with the abilities and upgrades I could gather, the more I realized how useful they were. Sometimes it was enough for me to see changes that were more automatic, but sometimes I saw things that were different based on how I utilized them. What I mean is that I liked how responsive attacking could be. It really depended on which weapon you preferred, something that I'll eventually get into, but it was great to see that how you attacked depended on how quickly or rhythmically you pressed or held the attack button down. For the most part, you're better off just holding it down, seeing as how this leads to a constant barrage. But I still like seeing how responsive this was depending on your actions. I'm sure that there are some players out there that could really manipulate this game and its systems to such a degree that things would seem incredibly easy for them, but even if I wasn't able to get to that same level as them, I still felt like a beast when I got certain abilities or my build just right. It wasn't just because I had fast attack speed and could dish out a lot of damage, but also because there was a clear difference between what I could do when I reached this level and how things were when I was just starting a run. I really shouldn't have felt this way, seeing as how I was playing within what the game established, but it still was incredibly easy to feel like a cheesy bastard. This was more noticeable the closer I got to the end of a run because by then I'd occasionally have abilities such as 5 total dashes or Ares Blade Rift ability that occur after each dash. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was all I'd do whenever I gained these abilities, but with how useful and easy to use they were, I relied on them more often than not. If anything, I'd say that it's because Hades' difficulty forced me to stick to what worked, what was safe, and what would bring me the results I wanted to see. The more I played, the more confident I started to feel, and at times I'd even think to myself that experimenting with drastically different builds would be fun. But before long, I also started to think about how I was going to cheese the hell out of everyone. There were many different reasons as to why I sometimes fell back to being safer rather than more daring, but one of the main ones was due to Hades getting harder the more you played. Normally, you'd expect the game to get easier the more you spend time with it, but what's interesting about Hades is that areas that you were once familiar with slowly start to become unfamiliar. Don't get me wrong, the areas are still more or less the same, at least visually, but before long you start to deal with harder general enemies and bosses. I noticed this being done when general enemies I previously dealt with started to have armor. At first, that was surprising, but I eventually came to realize that that was a good way of changing things up without going overboard. Later on, you'd see that it was possible to drastically change how Hades was played, but what's great is that it depended on whether or not you wanted that for yourself. There's a big difference between you as a player being forced into a situation versus one where you're a willing participant. I regularly bring up that the more choices I have in a game, the happier I'll be, and in regards to that, Hades didn't disappoint. To be a bit more specific, one thing that I really enjoyed about Hades was how responsive it was. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's like a sandbox and that there are no limits when it comes to playing this game, but enough was done to make me realize that a lot of effort and attention to detail went into it. In particular, I really enjoyed how side quests and events would come up as a result of how you were playing and what was happening to you. I could be wrong, and maybe this wasn't done on purpose, but at one point Athena gave me a specific ability due to how low my HP was. This was generally seen with dialogue that helped develop the main storyline and side quests. When this was noticeable as a result of how you were playing, that really stood out to me. As great as this was, there were also instances in which the game didn't work as freely as I would have liked. I realized that limits have to be put in place or else certain parts of Hades would come off as broken, but I still thought that it was a bit strange to see how open and inventive some parts of the game were, while also seeing that others were restrictive. One ability that helped me get through a great bulk of Hades was the Pierced Butterfly. It's because it allowed you to increase your attack power as long as you managed to play in a specific way. What disappointed me was seeing that this ability would only work up to a certain point. It could be due to the fact that the Temple of Styx is seen as being different than the rest of the areas in Hades, but with how drawn out it could sometimes be, I felt that it would have been useful to have been able to keep accumulating more attack power. Hades didn't go out of its way to tell me that this would happen, so it makes sense why it sometimes takes me a while to figure things out on my own. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's because I'm inattentive, but it's more due to the fact that I'm the kind of person that prefers to learn on their own. Getting a helping hand definitely makes things easier, but sometimes learning from failure is the best way to understand a concept or game. I say that, and yet sometimes I've gone hours without realizing that a specific mechanic or ability was possible. I'd say that it has more to do with how Hades is a deep game, but it took me over 20 hours before I realized that I could utilize God calls. I vaguely recall knowing that something like that was possible, but I assumed that they could only be used if you had something else first, or you had to reach a certain point within the story. By the time I realized that they could be used, I started to be more consistent and successful with my runs. What I really liked about the calls is that there were 2 specific ways that they could be used, and as a result of that, more strategies were available. You could just be patient and wait until the call was fully powered up, which would lead to you delivering a more destructive or helpful ability. But if you happen to be overwhelmed by whichever situation you were dealing with, you could use a less devastating form of your call before the gauge was full. It was only after I got used to relying on calls that I realized how necessary they were for me in my successful runs. Much like with other aspects of Hades, there were many options to choose from, but I usually stuck to what I was most familiar with. Seeing as how I regularly praise having more options to choose from in the game, I welcomed the fact that Hades offered all sorts of weapons, abilities, and extras. Every once in a while, I felt like trying new things out to keep things fresh, but before long I realized that I was better off sticking to what I was most familiar with. At first, my favorite weapons were the starting sword and the shield. I liked them because of how easy they were to use, but also because they allowed me to attack at a rapid pace. Seeing that more weapons could be used left me with the idea that I'd eventually get around to giving them a try, but some just felt off to me. Even if I eventually grew to love the spear and it's the weapon that allowed me to beat Hades the number of times that I did, it took a bit of a while to get used to. Initially, I thought that its fetch mechanics were weird. I didn't understand why the option to go fetch the spear was there when I could simply call it back. That option being there is nice, but trying to retrieve it in such a way during hectic battles would have just come off as counterproductive. The more time I spent with the spear, the more I realized how great it really was. For starters, its long attack range really stood out to me. Even without being upgraded, it was deadlier than the starting sword, but once I started to upgrade it and got speed boost for it, that's when I saw just how awesome it truly was. Speed alone isn't enough, but when an attack power boost was combined with the spear's speed, even armored enemies could be killed within seconds. Hades is the kind of game that you could speedrun, but I really didn't have that in mind. There were moments where I wanted to get through it as fast as possible, but that was because trying to hit 10 runs eventually started to feel like a bit much. It was during those moments that I could fall back on the spear. As I said before, Hades is the kind of game that delivers the good in just about every way possible. With some aspects of the game that was clearly seen than with others, but one of the most obvious ways was with its artwork. To say that the artwork in Hades is great would be an understatement. Even when I was still only a few hours into playing, I started to see if an art book was available, and I wasn't surprised to see that it was. It's because I got to the second area of Hades and it looked even better than the first. The overall artwork of Hades was very well done, but this could also be seen with its gameplay. With Hades being as combat heavy as it is, it makes sense why that be made as visually appealing as it was. The character animation was really smooth, and I liked how getting a lot of abilities made things super flashy. At times this would work against me, as I previously mentioned, but despite the minor inconvenience, I was still more or less getting to witness a colorful display on screen. The following was simple, but sometimes it's the small details that matter the most. I regularly like to bring up how a game displays attention to detail because it says so much about it and the devs. I liked how you were able to see feathers flying out of your weapon once you received Hermes' attack speed ability. I'm sure that other abilities worked in a similar way, but that one really stood out to me. One of the ways that Hades kept surprising me over 50 hours into it was thanks to its art design. By this point, it was clear to me that a lot of attention and talent went into this aspect of the game, but it's because I ran into Karen in a room that looked completely different from the other ones. It was still a continuation of the overall theme of the second area in Hades, but there was enough different about it. I know that I saw enough of Hades thanks to having spent 54 hours with it, but moments such as this one, among many others, left me thinking that it's possible that there are still parts of the game I've yet to see or discover. Hades is replayable as it is, but if I were a completionist, chances are that I could easily hit 75 hours of playtime thanks to simply wanting to make sure that I've scoured every inch of this game. For the most part, I'd say that I'm the kind of player that's able to balance experiencing the main storyline of a game along with bits and pieces of side quests here and there, but Hades was made in such a way that it was incredibly easy to experience both without requiring too much from you. Being able to deliver an entertaining story with great dialogue is easier said than done, but Hades managed to do a great job here as well. One thing I liked was how what the characters said changed depending on who you've already spoken to. This usually depends on where in the main storyline you are or whichever side quest you happen to be in the middle of, but I really liked this because it successfully accomplished multiple things at once. It progressed the story, it made me feel that my actions mattered, it made an entertaining game even more entertaining, and it was another example of the fact that the makers of this game knew what they were doing. Other games are capable of this, but one or more things usually tends to suffer. I don't think Hades is a perfect game, and it's possible that my overall enjoyment of it has blinded me to some of the ways that it's flawed, but I really liked how this affected my experience. What I mean is that the characters in Hades didn't feel one-dimensional. It felt as if they all had their own lives and problems to deal with while Zagreus was in the middle of trying to escape. This could also be seen thanks to the nicknames some of the characters had for each other. Much like in real life, nicknames in terms of endearment revealed the familiarity that exists between people and or characters. It's something simple, but it makes it so that you're aware that things were happening before you even started the game. As vast as Hades is, this made the game feel even vaster. It also helped that all of this was entertaining. Zagreus was the kind of character that was very quippy, and that made it so that interactions between him and certain characters, along with the narrator, were both great and memorable. Much like with other aspects of the game, I'm also pretty sure that some of the dialogue was affected by your playstyle. This was immediately seen after I spoke to the elusive huntress. She more or less told me that I'm in a hurry and that playing in such a way would lead to me making mistakes. That makes sense, because during certain points of my playthrough of Hades, I wanted to advance as quickly as possible. I was having fun and I quickly realized it was a high quality game, but that doesn't change the fact that I have a ton of games I'd like to get around to playing, and I ended up spending more time with Hades than I initially thought I would. It's possible that playing in such a way made it easier to miss out on some more subtle elements of the game, but seeing as how I played Hades for as long as I did, I feel confident in saying that I got to experience the bulk of what it has to offer. As I previously mentioned, I like to balance the time I spend on a game's main storyline and its side quests. It usually depends on how I feel about the latter, and if that experience isn't as repetitive or tedious as it occasionally tends to be, but that wasn't the case with Hades. What I liked was how the side quests vaguely reminded me of Dark Souls. What I mean is that you really don't know when you'll encounter them. Since no run is exactly the same as a previous one, it could sometimes be a while before you encounter a character that has an active side quest, so it's a pleasant surprise when you do. I'm sure that some may dislike lacking toil control with this aspect of the game, but that simply added to the memorability of these moments. That took a bit of getting used to, but what I did like was how even if I wasn't able to control the development of these side quests as much as I would have liked, it was still possible to decide whether or not to pursue them. For example, when I had Achilles' ELYSIUM side quest active, I knew that I should go to the exclamation point room to keep things going. This could be seen with other characters and in other parts of Hades, so that was enough for me. Besides how the dialogue and story development in Hades worked, the fact that a great deal of it was entertaining is something worth bringing up. Simply put, Zagreus was a charismatic character. He wasn't an upbeat loudmouth, but there were plenty of laugh-out-loud moments. What Zagreus said and how the game responded to this made me realize that the devs had a sense of humor when it came to certain parts of Hades, and I liked that. In particular, there was a moment when Zagreus casually referred to the Bone Hydra as learning, and the next time you fight it, that's its name. It was a simple gesture, but it was a memorable one that added to my overall enjoyment of this game. I'm sure that I've mentioned this multiple times throughout my reviews, but creating a game that's both difficult and entertaining isn't easy. The bulk of the issue revolves around trying to avoid making a game punishing to the point where all it does is turn people away. There were points in Hades where I was getting stressed out and got close to rage quitting, but for the most part, I'd say that it's a fair game. During my first few runs, I realized that no matter how hard you try, you simply do a little better each time. I'm sure that it has to do with the type of game that Hades is, but it really depended on you failing and learning from your mistakes. At times it also reminded me of guitar playing because it could be as easy or as hard as you want it to be. What I mean is that you could stick to the basics such as relying on your preferred weapons and abilities, or you could try to master the game's mechanics to such a degree that you could determine what to pursue depending on where in your run you were. I eventually got pretty close to that, but it wouldn't surprise me if what I was capable of pales in comparison to those that really mastered Hades' gameplay. Earlier in this review, I mentioned that Hades is a repetitive game that's not repetitive, and that could be seen in many different ways. But in relation to this topic, it was thanks to how different things would become depending on how far into the game you got. What I liked was that even the beginning areas of the game started to get harder to deal with the more you unlocked. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this affected my motivation to get through Hades, but it definitely led to some occasional moments of frustration. What's good is that despite that, the overall fun experience I had with Hades was enough to keep me going. It was due to Hades' difficulty that I started to expect the game to offer me shortcuts, especially after I completed a new area, but that didn't end up happening. I realize that complaining about this doesn't make sense, seeing as how this is largely the point of these kinds of games, but it got annoying advancing far into the game, dying, and having to start all the way from the beginning. Sometimes this wasn't that bad to deal with, but it was especially worse when I had dedicated a lot of time into a run, and I had a build I was very happy with. I guess Spelunky 1 spoiled me. I like to think of myself as being a player that's capable of overcoming all sorts of odds when it comes to hard games, but I'm also aware of my limits. I don't see myself doing knife-only runs in Resident Evil anytime soon, but I'm also not the kind of player that'll pass on playing games such as Cuphead or Super Meat Boy. Hades wasn't challenging to that degree, but it still managed to make me sweaty and stressed while trying to beat certain parts of it. That doesn't happen too often, so when it does, I remember it. Every area of Hades had something about it that made it difficult to deal with, but during my first dozen or so runs, most of the time I was struggling to get through ELYSIUM. It didn't offer anything that was drastically different from the first 2 areas in Hades, but when I was initially trying to beat the game, it was definitely challenging, even before I got to the area's bosses. You're occasionally forced to face too many bosses at once, even in the first area of Hades, but in ELYSIUM it was taken to the next level. I recognize that it probably wasn't the hardest boss battle that the game had to offer, seeing as how I hadn't even reached the final boss, but for a decent stretch of time trying to deal with this was a huge pain. No matter which game I'm playing, I'll still recognize that fighting 2 bosses at once is overkill, but some games are merciful when it comes to how these battles play out. In some games you can easily get bosses to damage each other, and you could officially get to the point where you simply have to deal with one, but it wasn't completely like that in Hades. With how aggressive and explosive these bosses came off, it would have been great had the enemies been able to do serious damage to each other. It would have added a greater level of strategy to deal with, and it would have made things more manageable. What's great about this is that it can make things easier without really doing so. It's one thing to suggest lowering the difficulty level for a boss fight that's too hard for you, but if you can make it so that your skill allows you to exercise more control in a situation such as this one, that'd be great. This is something I had in mind during the ELYSIUM boss fight because it left me thinking how that would have been perfect for the kind of fight that was. Both enemies were aggressive, melee based, and the key to advancing was constantly being on the move. Seeing that this wouldn't happen was frustrating because there were times when the Minotaur would be swinging his axe in the direction of Theseus, only for that to result in nothing. Facing multiple enemies at once during boss fights stood out to me not only because they were difficult to deal with, but also because this sometimes forced me to resort to cheesy tactics. I figured that as long as you're not actually cheating and you're working within the rules of a game, it's all good, but I'd be lying if I said that having to resort to cheap tactics to get ahead in a game didn't leave me wondering if I was actually skilled or simply crafty. After a decent number of attempts, I came to the realization that the Hydra wasn't as hard as some of the other bosses, but during my first few tries, it definitely took a lot out of me. At one point, I started to rely on the Blade Rift ability, and that got me the result I wanted to see, but that left me thinking if I was cheating myself. What I mean is that chances are that I would have been better prepared for what the rest of the game had to offer had I approached some of these fights differently, so I wouldn't have struggled as bad as I would later on in Hades. If anything, I liked how Hades would sometimes take bosses and start to use them as general enemies. That left me asking myself when did taking bosses and turning them into general enemies once they've been defeated originally start, but then I realized that was a good way of keeping you on your toes. An enemy that's already been defeated isn't as challenging as one that's yet to be defeated, but there are still remnants of what made it challenging in the first place. It was after I defeated Meg and her sisters multiple times that I realized that one of them was easier than Meg herself. What I'm getting at is that you'd expect subsequent bosses to be harder to deal with than the first, but I'd say that has more to do with my skill as a player. It's funny, but after a certain point I came to the realization that I missed Meg. I enjoyed how her battle arena was more open than some of the other ones, and her banter before fights was more interesting than what some of her sisters had to say. I'm sure that some of you may be thinking that's not important while on the subject of boss battles, but a boss battle itself is great due to the sum of all its parts, and not simply because of a single thing. Many games don't agree with that sentiment, but from what I've experienced, some of my favorite boss battles are my favorites because of how they develop the game's storyline, the accompanying music, the skill required to advance, or simply because it's cool looking. To some, boss battles requiring a high skill level to advance isn't a good thing, but as long as it's well balanced and it adds to the overall experience, I'd say that it is. I don't recall when I made note of this, but after a certain point I came to the conclusion that the bosses changing based on the number of runs I attempted would lead to me being in for a rough time. This definitely added to Hades' replayability and keeping things fresh, but after a while I was looking for shortcuts instead of more challenges. It was during the ELYSIUM boss battle that I started to think and hope that Zagreus would eventually convince the Minotaur to just leave, kinda like Naruto's Talk no Jutsu. This idea came as a result of the exchanges that Zagreus and the Minotaur would have just before the fight started. With how they interacted with each other, it was clear that there was a mutual respect between them, and I was hoping that'd result in altering future instances of this boss battle. By this point, Hades had shown me that it was possible for the main quest and side quests to be altered based on the interactions between characters, so I was hoping that this would spill over to the action side of things. I'm sure that me bringing this up makes it seem as if I'm the kind of person that wants to take the easy way out, but the saying, work smarter, not harder, comes to mind. Even if you haven't played Hades, chances are that you've heard of how hard it is. As I've already described multiple times throughout this review, there were plenty of occasions that left me frustrated and wanting to take a break. Despite deciding to play this game because of all the good things I heard about it, one of the big reasons was because I thought it could be beaten in around 20 hours. I realize that playing games based on how long it may take to beat them seems like a silly thing to do, but this helps when it comes to attempting to get through your backlog, and I simply enjoy playing through many different games. I didn't want to take longer than I needed to get through Hades, but I eventually got to the point where I assumed that I'd hit 60 hours by the time that I was done with it. I was off by 6 hours, but the point still stands that Hades did a lot to keep me occupied for as long as it did. The difficulty was definitely a factor when it came to why I played for as long as I did, but I'd say that was only a small part of the equation. Much like with other games and some things in life, Hades being as hard as it sometimes was made beating it that much sweeter. It's because I had to grow as a player in order to advance, and I'm the kind of person that enjoys seeing myself make progress, no matter what kind of activity I may be interacting with. Dedicating this amount of time to a single game may seem like overkill to some, but not to me. Simply because Hades is a well-made game, but also because I was determined to beat it. I eventually realized that it took me 30 hours to get a successful run, but my time with Hades wouldn't end there. I love playing games and beating them, but I'm not a completionist. Once I've beaten a game's main storyline and feel as if I've seen enough of it, I'll move on to the next thing. You'd think that means that I wasn't interested in having to beat Hades 9 more times in order to get the true ending, but that wasn't the case here. The reason why I didn't mind playing Hades as much as I did was because I grew to enjoy it that much, but also because it managed to keep me entertained. What I mean is that even after 50 hours of playtime, there were still runs where I just barely made it through. By that point, I wouldn't say that it was due to my lack of skills as a player, but more so due to the fact that even if I knew what I was doing and what would help me advance, sometimes I couldn't escape from the random nature of which abilities would show up and when. At one point, I tried to make do with whatever I had because I wanted to see the true ending and move on, but even then, Hades more or less showed me that it was still in charge. One of the best compliments I can give Hades is that it's a game that isn't part of a franchise, and yet it still managed to leave me wanting to replay it. What I mean is that at this point in my life, Resident Evil is pretty much the only franchise that'll have me hooked to its games when they're initially released. There are plenty of new games that are great, but it takes a lot for them to leave me wanting to immediately play through them again, or simply come back to them at a later time. It's for this reason why I feel that Hades managed to accomplish something special. If you haven't realized by now, I'm a patient gamer. I prefer buying my games when they're on sale because it saves me money, but also because I have a massive backlog of games to choose from. While all of that's true, I'll sometimes make an exception if a game such as Resident Evil is released, or if it's just really hyped up by the gaming community, and I like what I see. Hades was a game that I bought on sale, but after seeing what it has to offer, I say that it's the kind of game where you wouldn't mind buying it at full price. Long story short, I loved Hades. Seeing as how I played it on PC, it's the kind of game that makes me want to get a physical copy, and very few can motivate me to do that. I don't see myself revisiting Hades anytime soon because of how many times I've already played through it, but it's for sure the kind of game where I'd be willing to replay it on a different platform such as the Nintendo Switch. If it isn't clear by now, I definitely recommend Hades. Even if it may be too hard for some of you, you should still get it so that you at least have the option to experience what you're willing to put up with. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.